Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Dissenter Weekly. It's January 9th. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor of Shadowproof.com.
I'm Brian Sonstein, publishing editor of Shadowproof.
And this week, we're going to be running down major whistleblower stories from the past week. We're going to be talking about EPA employees that are unionized who are fighting for whistleblower protections. We've also got an update on Julian Assange's extradition case, but before that, Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind people to please hit that red subscribe button below this video so that you can stay up to date on all of our videos. And also follow us on Facebook and Twitter at ShadowProofCom to stay up to date on all of our stories. And last but not least, Shadowproof is a 100% reader-funded website. We depend on your donations to do this show, to pay our writers, to keep the website online. So please go to shadowproof.com/donate and take a look at our donation options and consider supporting us. Kevin, you ready to jump in? You want to start off with our first story on the EPA?
Yeah, our first story, which I found covered by The Hill, is EPA employees are pushing a Bill of Rights in order to protect scientific integrity. That's the headline at The Hill, but what's within the article is a mention that part of this Bill of Rights that these employees and their unionized employees that they're fighting for, they would like to get whistleblower protections into this Bill of Rights. I think that's hugely crucial when we consider the makeup of the Trump administration and what has happened in the last 3 or so years. We know that Donald Trump's administration denies climate change. They've rolled back environmental protections. There's a recent report from the New York Times, in fact, that the Trump administration plans to unravel environmental law to make it even more friendly than it already is to the oil and gas industry and other corporations. And basically, they want to remove a process that has required environmental review undo that. So it'd be critical for whistleblowers at the EPA to be able to come forward and to have protections so that they can expose what the Trump administration is doing to dismantle environmental protections and protections to human health. And so as they work out this new contract, one of the things included is a right to protect human health and the environment, to protect environmental justice, communities, and to work without fear of reprisal. There's a EPA whistleblower who's anonymously mentioned in this article that was put on administrative leave in 2018, and allegedly because of pushback that this whistleblower received against, from the administration. This whistleblower was fighting Scott Pruitt when Scott Pruitt was the EPA administrator. And throughout the Trump administration, there's been constant criticism about the EPA sidelining employees as well as scientists when rolling out policies, presumably because many of these policies have been worked out with people in the energy industry in order to suit them. And so this is an important development here. We'll watch to see what happens with the negotiations with these unionized EPA employees, but it's absolutely critical that there would be whistleblower protections that were not only what we have as the status quo, but also improved upon going forward so that they can challenge. I mean, just look around us. We mentioned it last week, but I'll mention it again because it hasn't gone away. You see the brush fires happening in Australia. The signs are there for the global climate catastrophe, and something has to be done. And in spite of the leadership in the White House, you need people at the EPA who can keep pushing back and exposing what is being done by industry to dismantle environmental protections.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really important story. I mean, we'll always need whistleblowers, but especially right now, I think as came up on the show that you did last week with John Kiriakou, particularly with this story as it pertains to the climate, I think it's absolutely critical that we have the protections in place to allow for whistleblowers to come forward, particularly on the issue of the environment. Thank you for that, Kevin. I want to take us to our next story here. on the Labor Department and Tennessee Valley Authority. Can you tell us a bit about what's going on here?
Yeah, this has been percolating for a little while. This is the first time, though, that I've had an opportunity to cover it in this latest development. You have the Tennessee Valley Authority being told by the Labor Department that, in fact, the Labor Department does agree and side with a whistleblower that this nuclear engineer at the Tennessee Valley Authority was fired or retaliated against for blowing the whistle on safety concerns. And in fact, the TVA lied about it. The Labor Department is ordering TVA to give this whistleblower named Beth Wetzel her job back, as well as to shell out more than $200,000 in back pay, lost bonuses and benefits, compensatory damages, and legal fees. That's according to the Knoxville News Sentinel, which is a local newspaper. And the TVA had cooked up this scenario that apparently she had badmouthed the supervisor, and so that is why she faced the sort of retaliation that she experienced. They said that perhaps she maybe had there was more to it than sincerity when she accused this supervisor of having inexperience and of ignoring safety complaints that were existent. And then eventually Wetzel did actually request to move to Washington, D.C. and take up a job there, still working on nuclear related issues. But she fought this. She complained about the sort of treatment that she was getting. And I think she experienced retaliation while she was in D.C. And so that led to this. And so I think this is an important case, especially when we're talking about nuclear safety. I mean, nuclear whistleblowers around nuclear energy, or whether it involves these sites where we used to develop nuclear weapons and people are taking care of the radioactive waste that remains. There are a huge amount of whistleblowers that have come forward over the years because corporations are constantly cutting corners when it comes to taking care of pollution and protecting people's public health. So this is an important story, and obviously, if you want to give a candid response about whether somebody should be able to get a job, you should not face retaliation for sharing the fact that you think a certain person is not qualified to serve in that position.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a side reminder that we'll have links to all of these stories, and I encourage people to read them. This is definitely an important one. Let's keep it moving here. Tell us about Teva Pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, so Teva agreed to pay $54 million to settle a whistleblower lawsuit over speaker programs. I'm sure that, I'm very confident that Teva is not the only pharmaceutical corporation that could be found guilty of this. And this particular case, however, involves Teva and two subsidiaries, and the fact that basically they were paying physicians to be speakers or consultants, or to be paid as if they were speakers or consultants, and then to go speak as part of programs that were essentially quote unquote sham events. And so then that will qualify as something where they could pay the doctors. And then in getting that payment, they were basically part of, they were getting paid. And then in response, they would go and boost prescriptions for these two Teva products. So to connect the loop here, you get paid to go speak for the pharmaceutical corporation. And that's sort of the payout, because when you're actually working your job as a physician, you're going around and you're having patients use this particular drug. We're talking about something like, it's called Copaxone, which is a multiple sclerosis treatment. And we're also talking about Azilect, which is a Parkinson's disease drug. So those particular were the drugs that were singled out as ones the doctors were prescribing specifically as part of this arrangement. And this stemmed from a whistleblower complaint. And so again, we have another example here. And it occurs to me now that we have two successful whistleblower cases, so to speak, where whistleblowers are winning. and they're using the mechanisms that they have available. The nuclear engineer used the Labor Department, and that's a more of an administrative kind of a challenge. And then you've got this here where you're using the court system. And I believe this was through the False Claims Act, which is, we mentioned last week, if you go back to that episode with John Kiriakou, we talked about the False Claims Act and how that's a very standard, widely used law that whistleblowers, as well as attorneys who will represent whistleblowers, will use in order to challenge fraud by corporations. So again, this is good development. I think it probably speaks to a real aspect of our for-profit healthcare system.
Yeah, definitely a very troubling conflict of interest there. So I'm glad this was a successful challenge by a whistleblower. How about our next story here? Illinois appeals court judges seem open to overturning jury award for CPD whistleblower.
Yeah, so this is a local story. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm familiar with what's going on here. And so I just want to give some background first, because earlier at Shadowproof, I covered when the local radio station WBEZ covered this. It was a story about a Chicago police investigator who was fired for resisting orders to change findings against other Chicago police officers. And this individual was part of the Independent Police Review Authority in Chicago, which was set up. Doesn't really exist in the same form anymore because of what happened with the Laquan McDonald shooting in Chicago. This was a teenager, a black teen, who was killed by Jason Van Dyke, who was actually successfully prosecuted for murdering Laquan McDonald. Although he didn't get that long of a sentence, but that's a whole other issue. But what happened is this man, Lorenzo Davis, a 65-year-old who also was a former Chicago Police Department, a police commander, had been terminated less than 2 weeks after top IPRA officials evaluated Davis's job performance and accused him of a clear bias against the police. These officials then called him the only supervisor at IPRA who resists making requested changes as directed by management in order to reflect the correct finding with respect to, officer-involved shootings that are known by the agency. So there were these performance evaluations, and apparently Davis was challenging these officer-involved shootings in the way that they were handled within the board. He was going against the grain, and typically, IPRA had this kind of culture where it was protecting police officers from prosecution. It was helping them not be punished for these violence and other crimes that they were committing as officers. And that would be in addition to shootings. It didn't have to just be limited to those shootings. So he had successfully fought this whistleblower lawsuit in the courts. He won in 2018. He was awarded $2.8 million. And that came from a Cook County jury after his dismissal in 2015. The city appealed. The city does not contest giving him $751,000 plus for lost salary and benefits, but they do not believe he should get $2 million for emotional distress. They think it should be reduced to $60,000. And the 3-judge Illinois appellate panel, what happened in the past week, the news story, the reason why we're talking about it this week is because they're apparently receptive to what the city has been saying, which is unfortunate for Lorenzo, who, has made this argument that essentially because he was fired, although he is 65, this is what he was doing in his career, and there's no place else for him to go. He can't do any other work anymore in the field that he was working in, and so that should be considered a contribution to his emotional distress. So he's made a claim for the $2 million because that's what he says is lost. I can no longer work in that position. And part of the interesting thing is about the appeal, the way that the appeal unfolded. They were actually apparently his lawyer and him were bringing up many police shootings in order to show what the CPD does on a regular basis, has done historically, and to put that out there as evidence that there would be a motive for retaliating against him if he challenged these shootings. So there's not been a ruling by the appeals court, but when we do have that ruling from the appeals court, we'll share it with you as to what happens with this whistleblower.
Thank you. And I'm just going to preemptively apologize if my dog barks in the next 2 seconds, but I want to take us to our next story. We'll definitely keep following this story out of Illinois. We've been following what's going on with the Chicago police, myriad stories about the Chicago police at Shadowproof. Kevin does really great reporting on that, and I encourage people to seek that out, and we'll link to it in the description. Our next story is on the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So we have Brittany Kaiser is an ex-Cambridge Analytica employee who has been posting files with a Twitter account called Hindsight Files. In fact, I am going to, on our live stream, pull it up right now just so that I have it available. But basically, she's been posting links to materials that were pieced together during the 2016 election. Cambridge Analytica was the subject of a Netflix documentary that has been shortlisted called The Great Hack. But essentially, Cambridge Analytica was involved in information warfare, and they compiled materials related to elections, not only in 2016 election in the United States, but they also paid attention to Malaysia. They paid attention to Kenya. They were paid close attention to the Brazil election. And so Kaiser has come forward with actual documents that suggest that, and there's also documents about John Bolton and Iran that were posted. And she's actually regularly posting over the next coming days more folders of files that contain information. There's a lot here that we could go through, and in the next week or two, we can come back to this and fill in some more specific information. But to start out with, I think just for today, what we really want to highlight is that in general, it's showing the kind of manipulation that was going on when the election was unfolding, and the way in which Cambridge Analytica would design fake websites, would prey on voters and manipulate them and get them to engage in behaviors that would benefit certain causes and or right-wing agendas. And that's really what I think is most important about this whistleblower story, and the fact that Kaiser is coming forward. This is information warfare. I mean, essentially, people are being made to think that they need to support certain different agendas. And Cambridge Analytica has collaborated with governments, intelligence agencies, corporations, political campaigns, and it's cloaked. You see this information, you don't know who's funneling this dark money and who is funding these, and it's made to look like news stories. It's a fake website, or it's made to look like something else, and you don't know exactly what is happening, and it's intended to deceive you, and it can be used in any parts of the world, and Cambridge Analytica is on the forefront of this. I think it's it's part of what we've come to understand as hybrid warfare, where not only do we have military components to our wars anymore, but we also need to fight with propaganda. And Cambridge Analytica held itself out as a firm that could assist in pushing such propaganda.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to our regular Julian Assange segment on the show. Can you tell us what is going on with that?
Yeah, so this week, the big news was that Mexico's president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, has called for the founder, Julian Assange, to be released from prison in London. That's a big deal. He's one of the I suppose, most prominent people who is in charge of a country. I guess most importantly, they border the United States. So, and they're an ally. And so for someone like that to come out and say against the United States that they believe Julian Assange should be released from jail, that is a huge deal. He mentions that I think he acknowledged that Julian had served some time for allegedly skipping bail. He made some vague comment about how he understands that perhaps Julian Assange made some choices that others disagree with. But he said, by and large, that at the time, the cables that he released, if you look at the diplomatic cables, those were hugely helpful to the Mexico government for learning about how the world functioned, in particular how the U.S. was making policy around Mexico and other countries. It helped to understand the authoritarian nature of a lot of parts of the world. And it also didn't just reflect on the United States, it reflected on many other countries as well. So I remember back in 2010 and 2011 covering the diplomatic cables and how Mexico was really interested in the contents of what was disclosed by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks. So he says that hopefully consideration will be given to what Julian Assange was able to do to add to our understanding, and that he'll be released and won't continue to be tortured. And he said that he was tortured, which I think is important because the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, has been calling attention to the mistreatment that has been experienced by Assange, which has been meted out by Ecuador and Sweden, but most significantly, the UK and the United States, being responsible for psychological torture that has been endured over the past decade. So it's a important development. And additionally, I have a tweet that went out from former Brazilian President Lula and the Workers' Party in Brazil that they are also demanding freedom for Assange. This tweet that was sent out on January 6th said, "We demand their immediate freedom as a means of restoring international law on the protection of political asylum and refugees. We defend Julian Assange for the deep commitment to defending freedom of information and the press, essential principles of democracy itself." And so that's very clear. And I recall that Glenn Greenwald over at The Intercept made an important point about how there are countries like this, Mexico and Brazil being the most recent examples, that have stepped up to advocate for Julian Assange's freedom. And in those countries, you can go to countries like France, you can look at Germany. There are these left-wing groups that are mobilizing for Julian Assange's freedom. There are people who recognize what is at stake and treat it as, you could say liberal and progressive, but there are left groups that are organizing to free Julian Assange. And then in the UK and the US, in contrast, it's mostly been treated as if it's kind of a right-wing conservative cause to call for the release of Julian Assange. And you could say that could be because of the interest in delegitimizing those kinds of pushes for freedom. I haven't quite seen an article posted yet that just plainly stated anyone who wants Julian Assange to be freed is carrying out the agenda of the Russian government, or they're pushing Kremlin-y talking points. But I suppose we could imagine that that's going to be coming here in the months ahead as we face or as we see the extradition hearing with Julian Assange unfold. And I think it speaks to a kind of failure among a lot of press freedom groups, the lack of solidarity among journalists in the United States, of the fact that people still want to maintain this fiction that Julian Assange is not a journalist, but a source, even though none of this material originates with him. He didn't work for any of these agencies in which he's exposing corruption. So he really can't be a source. He's at most a conduit. And then you're just using a word so that you don't have to accept the reality that he's a publisher who's involved in journalism. And he has a press card. So he's part of a trade union that has journalists in Australia and he's a part of groups that are involved in journalists. Unmistakably, he's a journalist, is what I'm saying. And so this is important that we see people coming forward, leaders. You've had dignitaries, you've had MPs in Germany that are stepping forward to support Julian Assange. You'll probably see some people in the UK come forward. And as we get closer to this extradition hearing and people are talking about this more, you're going to probably see others use the opportunity to let everyone know where they stand. Of course, all the presidential candidates in the Democratic Party are undoubtedly going to be asked about it going forward. So here's an opportunity for people to figure out which side they want to be on. And history is going to reflect on whether you were on the right side when it came to this case, especially when we look at the implications for what would happen if Julian was successfully brought to the US and put on trial.
Yeah, and in addition to the issues of his prosecution, I just want to add on the subject of his health and his treatment and the torture within the prison. Belmarsh is well known for being no prisons, there's no such thing as a good prison, but Belmarsh in particular is known for horrific conditions. In fact, an investigation began this week after a prisoner mysteriously died there after having asked to be classified as disabled. It's a place that has been found to be violent, to be unsanitary, and it's a high security prison. So there's also a great deal of control and isolation. And so I just wanted to sort of add that context in there as well. So how about you round us out like we have been doing on the show? Give us an update on Chelsea and on the amount of time that both Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange have been incarcerated at this point.
Yeah, so every week we highlight these cases that we're following and let people know how much time has elapsed again, so you can keep that in mind as you follow these cases with us. Chelsea Manning has been in jail for 302 days. She owes $193,000 in fines. Again, she's in jail because she is defying this grand jury that has been set up to destroy WikiLeaks. It's an active resistance, principled resistance. It's supposed to be coercive confinement if you keep somebody in jail for defying a grand jury, but it's only coercive if you think that's going to change the mind of a person and convince them to testify. And after that, they're not going to change their mind. It becomes punishment. And that's the evidence that should be considered and weighed in order to make the determination that Chelsea should be free. That's why Chelsea should be free. And this should be allowed to go forward without Chelsea being in jail. Julian Assange has been in jail for 273 days since he was expelled from the Ecuador embassy in London. We also have the fact that Jeremy Hammond is now there in the same facility as Chelsea Manning. And his sentence, there may be some questions about it, but it seems like it was suspended and disrupted. He was in a program that was going to help him be released at the end of last year. And now all of that went away. He was working he was part of a substance abuse program, and all of that disrupted by what has gone on with this WikiLeaks prosecution. Then you have Reality Winner, the NSA whistleblower, who is in a facility in Texas. And you have Terry Albury, who is an FBI whistleblower. Both of them are in completing sentences after being convicted of violations of the Espionage Act. And then you have the upcoming case of Daniel Hale, allegedly the drone whistleblower who provided documents to The Intercept on the assassination complex, which in the past week or two have taken on greater significance because of what happened with the attack on Iran General Qasem Soleimani. And so that legacy rings as we follow this case against Daniel Hale. In fact, at the end of last year in December, the judge threw out the motions to dismiss that the defense filed, objecting to the way the Espionage Act was brought against him by the government. And so it appears that this case is moving onward. And when we have an exact date for the trial, we'll certainly highlight that and talk about it on this show. And I would presume that I would make plans to go cover the Daniel Hale trial if it were to take place this year. If Daniel Hale does not take a plea agreement from the government, which can happen because of the sort of issues that are entailed with trying to put on a defense, particularly that you cannot put on a whistleblower defense when you are charged with violating the Espionage Act. So those are all of the cases to consider, and I'll let Brian finish us out.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I'm really looking forward to you traveling to the UK. You'll be in London next month covering Julian Assange's extradition hearing. So please stay with us. Subscribe by hitting that red button below the video. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and help us pay for Kevin's way to the UK to cover this really important hearing and to keep Shadowproof online, whether it's $5, $10, $20, whatever you can give. Go to shadowproof.com/donate and support us. Thank you so much, Kevin, for all you're doing, and we'll talk to everyone next week. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, no, if I just could get in one thing, you reminded me of something that I would just like to throw out there on the off chance that anybody's watching who is a journalist or is working with a media organization, has any interest in some kind of a collaboration or whatever. There's a lot of time still to do planning and prepare for coverage of the hearing. It's going to be difficult for a lot of journalists to get in there. Those who have done more planning than others are probably going to be in the courtroom. Those who have not made preparations and figured out the logistics are going to probably find themselves out with activists covering rallies outside the courthouse, talking to people after they come out of the courthouse to hear what happened, and you'll be hearing secondhand summaries. I've already been doing the work to ensure that I'm going to be inside the courthouse. And so if anybody out there wants to do anything to collaborate, you can contact the editor at shadowproof.com account, and we'll discuss whether there's some kind of way that we could work together on covering this important case, because I really do believe that it's important for progressive media especially to be covering this. It shouldn't just be a thing where like Breitbart or Reason.com or these libertarian or right-wing outlets cover it because they had some affinity for Assange when the Podesta emails were published to go after Hillary Clinton and make her weaker against Donald Trump. This is a story that we need to cover because it has no partisanship to it. This is an issue of press freedom. So if you have any interest in collaboration, again, email the editor at shadowproof.com and we can discuss possibilities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kevin. We will talk next week. Take care.